And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Stripe Dev Chats, where we talk about all of the cool and amazing things that are happening in the community of Stripe. Now, I am your host, Cecil Phillip, and I have a very special guest host today. I'm always excited when I have friends. I have friends today. And so I have my special co host, Kadasha from GitHub. You want to say hi to everyone?
Hi everyone, I am Kadesha. It's a long A, and I work at GitHub as a developer advocate, and I'm super excited to be here to talk to Wes and Dudley about their project.
Awesome. And so today we're going to be having a really interesting episode where we're actually going to be talking about how we can donate and help support open source projects using a tool called StackAid. Now, over the course of this show, we've spoken to founders and indie developers and PMs and engineers and all kinds of different folks, right? We always talk about like the consumption of software, right? Like the creation and consumption of it. But I think like there's another angle of that, and that is the actual supporting of it through our communities and through interesting projects like StackAid, right? And so we have some folks here that some of the founders of StackAid here. We have Wes and Dudley who are going to tell us all about it. How does it work? Give us a little bit of insight about that background story of it, and also tell us a little bit about where it's going to go to the future. So we're super excited about what we're going to talk about today. So why don't we just start with some introductions from the two of you folks? Wes, I see you're on the top of the screen, so I'm going to start with you first. Like, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what do you do?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Wes Carr, and I am in fact related to Dudley. We've been actually working together for the last, I don't know, like 20 years or so. I have the philosophy of it's just, keep your enemies close, right? So we've always worked together. We both, majored in computer science, had a startup ages ago in 2006 that landed us at Google, where we worked together for a number of years. We've had a few startups in between and different corporate ventures. And then when the pandemic hit in 2020, we were consulting at the time and decided to focus our efforts on COVID, and ended up developing some exposure notification app and testing portals and stuff for the state of Nevada. And after that phase ended, we wanted to see where else we could make a big impact. And we had never really done anything kind of geared towards developers such as ourselves. And we started looking at the landscape of open source, which of course we had used through our entire careers, and seeing how we could make a difference there. And so that's how we ended up on the idea of StackAid.
Nice. And Dudley, your turn. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. One of the problems of having such a long shared history is that when you go second, it's hard to come up with something new. Yeah, I'm slightly older than Wes, and so I had a couple of years working in investment banking prior to us doing our first startup, and I was so happy to get out of that and just get away from finance. Yeah, it's been a remarkable journey for both of us. Our time at Google was super interesting, especially in the heyday, back in the don't be evil days. And we had the fortune of working on products like Google Voice and Chrome and things like that. And I actually did product management for the majority of the time there, and Wes did a lot of development on Gmail and other projects. And so, it's in big contrast to how we started off. On our first startup, we fought about everything. We were in each other's business all the time, and then we realized this is a terrible way to work. And so we've had complementary sets of skills for the most part going forward. And yeah, it's been super interesting going between product engineering, thinking about consumer business to business applications, and then, as Wes mentioned, more recently, something in the public health space. It gives you a great appreciation just for some of the challenges that are there, and just the remarkable amount of effort that is being put in behind the scenes. And so we had a brief glimpse into what that looks like. And just to echo what Wes said, I think, this is our first foray into having a product or an experience that is focused on developers, and it's rewarding to build something that you can use yourself. And just the type of feedback that we get from other developers is also just great. And so we've really enjoyed this experience, and happy to go into details about that.
Nice.
Yeah.
I feel like the two of you have such a rich background, right? At least when it comes to like software and the business of software and those types of things. What do you think, like what parts of that history do you think kind of led you to creating StackAid?
Well, I think I had written about this a while back, but some of the earliest tools we used were open source, and like I literally could not get my job done without that stuff. And I think it had always kind of nagged me that I wasn't doing my part to give back, or maybe financially, or to contribute to open source. To me, it was like these people were, I had always like just revered really good open source projects and thought, okay, these people are just like beyond the skills that I have. And it's always, at least it appeared to me, so professional and polished and so on. And I guess over the course of my career, I thought, okay, well, maybe I can participate in this community, because I derive so much from it. And then I think there was just a confluence of factors. A lot more people, I think, kind of started changing their mindset about the sustainability of open source. It wasn't just for laughs anymore, and just like, oh, just do whatever with it. People are like, hey, this is a lot of large companies depend on this stuff. I put a lot of time and effort into this stuff. And maybe we should try a different model for how we should sustain open source. And I think it was, like I said, a number of factors came together where we had the time and opportunity and the expertise to make it what we think is a difference here.
Nice. So I have a question for you both. So is this your first open source project? And like, what has the journey been like to get to a project like StackAid?
I'll let Deli take that.
It's not our first open source project. So we've had open source contributions since over the last decade. I had a project, or still have a project, around a project called NSQ. I wrote the JavaScript driver for that, and that was certainly an interesting ride. And that was actually part of the work that we were doing at a company called Moz. And it was great. A lot of people started contributing. There's still a ton of contributions coming from China, of all places. It's just incredible, having watched how the focus of a particular technology shifted abroad. So we've had the pleasure of being able to work on the periphery of open source. It hasn't been our day job. And so, we're, as Wes mentioned, we use it all the time. We basically live on GitHub for the most part. I should note that while there are portions of StackAid that are open source, the whole platform isn't open source for a variety of reasons. But yeah, we, where it makes sense, we're open sourcing portions that we can share.
Yeah, like the question of open source sustainability has been one that I feel like we've been having it for forever, right? I remember a few jobs ago, right? There's this project, and it was called MB Unit. I don't think it's actively maintained anymore, but it was this unit testing framework for .NET applications specifically. And I learned about it because the company that I was working with at the time actually employed some number of the testing team. Like, we had a team focused on creating testing tools, and a number of those folks were actually dedicated to helping maintain and support that project, right? Because we would embed it in some of our existing tools, and then they obviously would contribute back and give back to that. And I think that was my first understanding of how companies could support open source. I wouldn't say how long ago this was. GitHub wasn't around, so this is how long ago it was. this I think it was on Coplex or SourceForge or one of those other platforms. It was like an SVN thing at the time. But again, it was like, oh wow, like I didn't know this was a thing that companies could do. Like I didn't know companies would support free software, right? Like that's amazing to me. And I think after that, I got in the habit of looking out more for open source projects, particularly the ones that I would use, and then trying to either answer questions in the threads, or like the Gitter channels or whatever the case is, or even trying to send back contributions to myself. But then it came a time where that project didn't exist anymore. It wasn't maintained anymore because people didn't have time, jobs and family, and like things happen, like life happens. And now this project didn't exist anymore, but now this corporate company has obviously invested a lot of time and effort into it. And so now I'm like, oh wow, well, like what are we gonna do now? What happens, right? Are we gonna own the project now? Is someone else gonna do it? Are we gonna have to migrate the code? You know what I mean? Can we pay someone else to support it while we continue to run business, right? And like all of these different types of questions, not just about this project, but I'm sure tons of other projects have these same types of questions, right? Like how do I support not just open source, but also the open source project that like my business is based off of? And again, like it's just it's a question that we've been having, I feel like, for a very, very long time, right? And so when I see projects like yours come to light, like I really appreciate not just the work and effort, but just the thoughtfulness of trying to make this opportunity available for so many different folks that are doing these projects in their spare time, when their family's asleep and they're up at 2:00 in the morning answering questions and hacking on things and working on the weekends and stuff like that. Because you never know what people are doing when they're at home, right? And then they're giving you their time to do these things. So again, I just want to say I really appreciate when folks like yourself create like these opportunities to again push for that narrative of like maintaining open source sustainability.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think part of the reason why we, like Wes said, why we're doing this is because we feel a debt of gratitude to open source in general. We obviously would like this to be something that we can focus on for the next decade and have it be a viable business, not necessarily a business that grows leaps and bounds, but a business that is proportionate to what we are doing for the community. But I think it's an important problem to tackle. And so hopefully over the next couple of years, we make a meaningful impact on it. And, there's this portion of the space around funding for developers that makes sense for us. But I think a big part of it, and I think GitHub has done an amazing job with GitHub sponsors, is evangelizing and normalizing financial contributions. And I think it is, I really think, to that NB unit example that you were talking about, it really demonstrates that, the fun part is really in the beginning when you're kind of starting a project and you are manifesting an idea into to reality and having it be used. And then over time, it becomes more complicated, right? The fun kind of drains from it, but there's real dependency on a project like that. And when those developers melt away, it has a real business impact. And I think that is something that is just not part of the calculus right now. I think some businesses kind of understand that, there's exposure to open source projects, but they, it's like, it's like climate change. Like, hey, it's someone else's problem down the road, right? Well, let them worry about that. And I think, smart teams kind of know this, but I think, I think our biggest challenge is actually bringing that reality to people today, so they understand that there's a problem here today, and you ought to do something about it before it becomes a serious issue, and you have to rewrite or rip out things at a critical phase for your business later on. So that's really, that's our challenge, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that a little later.
Sure. So I feel like we've been talking about StackAid, but we actually haven't spoken about StackAid yet. So why don't we kind of just dive right into it, right? Like what exactly is StackAid, and like how is it different from some of these other sponsorship type platforms?
Yeah, I think, so as I had mentioned, I think Open Collective and GitHub sponsors really evangelized funding of open source projects. And those models, I think, really, came after, the GoFundMe kind of revolution that happened, right? And so that idea just spread to lots of different verticals. And I think it just also happened at a time when there's an explosion in terms of the number of repositories, the level of contributions, the openness that people had with respect to their source code. And I think you started seeing a wide variety of projects, right? There's large projects that have funding that are backed by organizations or corporations, and then there's a large chunk of developers out there that have super popular projects, but it's an individually maintained, or it's a handful of developers maintaining something, and it's not commercial in nature. And I think those projects really struggled, and I think that's kind of where the initial fit was for GitHub sponsors and Open Collective. The realization that we had, and honestly, I think others contemporaneously have also had that realization, is that we benefit from the fact that we are declarative about our dependencies, right? So in the Node.js ecosystem, you have a package.json, and we literally just spell out, like, here are all your dependencies, right? And it dawned on us at one point that, for the people who are not getting recognized because they're not React or they're not Vue or one of those projects, we could actually discover who they are. And, we also realized that people want to support the things that they're actually using. There's a direct connection there. And so we wanted to take that idea of taking that declarative dependency list and exposing that to you, and just making it super easy for you to fund the sets of things that you're using. It turns out that calculus is super complicated, partly because you can have a massive dependency tree. There's that if you look at the node modules black hole
Right.
meme out there, you realize that it can be pretty intractable even for relatively small projects. And so we've had to balance, what do we fund, what do we not fund, things like that. And we ended up coming up with a model that looks at the first layer, the direct dependencies, and the second layer, indirect dependencies, and figuring out how to distribute money between them in a way that is equitable. And we ended up running a big simulation of about 5,000 customers using real world projects just to see how we distribute money relative to GitHub sponsors and Open Collective. And I think, to what we found out is that we do slightly better in terms of reaching kind of middle-sized projects and things like that. So there's potential benefit to this automation project because you can get potentially more money to projects that people wouldn't necessarily have top of mind. The other thing that, part of the motivation for us is that we don't think developers should be marketers. Like, it's kind of one of our core things. I think there are developers that are super good at marketing and they do an amazing job, and it's just part of their natural ability. But how many developers does GitHub have now? 50 to 100 million developers. Like, you can't expect them all to be marketers and promote their stuff. And so we need platforms that allow them to do the thing that they're super good at, which is develop software. I mean, clearly they need to document and do things like that make it approachable, but they don't need to, have a YouTube channel and all the other things in order for people to be aware. And so I think this is kind of, we're trying to solve some of those problems, in a new way.
So tell me, I'm curious about this model. So I know that you, I can give you $10 and then you will break that $10 down into bits and pieces to the very smallest dependency that's in my project. How do you decide what percentage or how much goes to a particular dependency? How does that work?
Yeah, so the way that it works right now is if let's say you have $10 and you have 10 direct dependencies, you're going to get $1 sent to each one of those. And then each one of those dependencies splits that dollar with their dependencies. So if let's say I give, money to Webpack, I give them $1, and then Webpack has, 10 dependencies of its own, it'll take 50 cents and allocate that amongst all of its dependencies. So it's kind of a pay it forward model. And the whole point is there that we recognize that very large and popular projects are also built on the shoulders of giants that people just may not know about, right? and we have some safeguards in place. So if, like React or one of those only has like one dependency, it's not going to just give 50% of its money to just one dependent, just split it, 50-50 with one dependency. So we do have some limits in place there, but it would share up to half of the money. And so, which I think makes us fairly unique in terms of how we fund our dependencies. And that's, again, why we wanted to run a simulation to make sure, like, oh, how does this model like play out in the real world? And we felt that, one of the surprising things that we learned was many of the projects out there are only indirect dependencies. You never like declare them in your package JSON file, right? And so should they not be funded? And so we actually have a number of projects that get only money through being an indirect dependency, and they actually do quite well that way. Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting model, because I think about projects like Core.js that is used by almost everyone on the internet, but then the maintainer, he said the other day that he is flat out broke, and we're all just like, what? Everyone uses your package, so how is that possible? So I think this model kind of helps to solve that problem, and it's such an interesting solution to the problem, like trickling the funds down all the way to the very minimum dependency.
No, that's exactly the type of use case that we had in mind. I mean, that poor guy too, he was working for prison, trying to maintain the project, which is amazing. But yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that we were going after when we thought of this model.
Yeah, Dudley, you had mentioned like the black hole, right, of kind of going down dependency trees. Like how far down do you go? I guess I'm wondering, because I guess, sure, like if I have 5-6 layers deep of dependencies, like sure, like I could see that. But I've seen some of these package graphs, and they go down tens of, they go down pretty deep, right? And so I'm going to assume that at some point, like you have to stop, because at that point you'd be giving folks fractions of cents. You know what I mean? If you go down too low. So like what's the limit on the depth of the dependency tree that you support?
We go down 2 levels.
Two levels, okay.
2 levels.
So there's the direct dependencies and their direct dependencies, and that's where we cut it off.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. We had looked at going further, but like you said, the returns, it's just diminishing returns, and people would not be able to get any kind of fruitful compensation if we go further down than that.
It turns out that the way that our model works is that we effectively recommend a certain amount, like $20 to $25 per month per developer in terms of open source contributions. And that's a number that is made up. But it balances kind of the appetite that it's a real impact to individual developers if they're doing it out of their own pocketbook, but it is actually proportional to the number of packages that we end up supporting, right? So for an individual developer working on maybe multiple projects, they likely have up to 100 kind of direct dependencies and potentially a couple hundred indirect. And if you look at then taking that $20 and splitting, the aggregate amount of that over a year and splitting it up across those dependencies, it becomes meaningful. But those numbers kind of balance out the realities of the amount that people use. And if we went far beyond that, then you're splitting money into such small fractions that you would have to have such a large number of developers using something like StackAid before people start getting real numbers, real money in it. So that was, again, part of the balance that we try to strike with what to include and what not to include.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I'd love for us to actually see what this experience looks like. So why don't we head over to Dudley's screen? Why don't we pull the screen up real quick, and then we can kind of start walking the path, right, of like seeing what the user experience of StackAid looks like. So Dudley, I'm going to pull up your screen in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. All right. So this is StackAid.com right now, right?
StackAid.us.
StackAid.us. I'm sorry.
Yeah. StackAid.us. Yeah.
StackAid us. There we go.
Yeah. So Wes and I wanted something very retro. I think when we decided on like the aesthetic and kind of the principles behind StackAid, we wanted something that is retro. And this was at the time. Is crypto a thing anymore? Is that like a thing of the past? Because it was really bothering us at the time.
That's funny.
And we're just like, let's just go back. Like, can we go back? So really, that ethos is kind of in this project, and we wanted, we also wanted a project and a presentation that is focused on developers, which is it's more like this is what it is, and our homepage is really an FAQ that kind of describe the intricacies, and so it's by developers for developers, and so that's it. So one of the first things we try to do is take package.json, which this one is it's actually based on ours and for the main website, and we list all of the dependencies that we have, and then when you run this thing, it actually spits out here's your top level dependencies, and here's the second order dependencies. And so if you had a team of 5 developers and you're doing $25 per developer per month, this is over a yearly basis. This is kind of how that breaks down for each of these projects. And so, like, definitely you can potentially have dependencies on that directly and indirectly multiple times. And so that's the case here, and it ends up getting a little bit more money than some of the other projects. And then it kind of just goes down the list from there. So this is kind of the core model at work, based on a package.json that actually has a fair number of dependencies. And so, ESLint here is going to get $33, and it actually has a bunch of other kind of dependencies underneath. And, each one of these, based on this subscription, is going to get a little less than $1 per year. ESLint is quite popular, and so these projects via ESLint will get a fair amount of money, provided ESLint is just quite popular. But this one particular set of subscriptions is going to give it a little less. But ESLint does fairly well overall. So that's kind of so anyway, that's the homepage, and it really kind of dives deep into this. And then a lot of the things that we've run into along the way is that I think people kind of get the model, and then it just produces a ton of questions about how do you allocate, what happens if people aren't receiving the funds, like what if they're not signed up for StackAid, things like that. And so we try and address some of those things. But before we jump into those things, I'll make it a little bit more concrete. And so last night I created a sample project. It's a project that it's a hypothetical project. There's no actual code here. It's just configuration files. But it is a Go project that has a solid.js front end using Tailwind, and it talks to a Postgres database, right? So we've declared all the dependencies among these things. So if you go into the go.mod, sorry, I realize that's probably a little small. You can see that we depend on this popular Go project called PGX, and that's to connect to a Postgres database. And if you go into the package.json, you see, Tailwind, TypeScript, Zod, Solid, great, just what you would expect. And those are declared dependencies. And then, but for Postgres, there's you install Postgres potentially in the cloud or somewhere else. There's no manifest that says I use Postgres. And so we have something called a StackAid.json, which is something that you can produce yourself. And it literally lists some of the technologies that don't show up in your kind of package manager. So we have Node, we have Postgres, and then we have some of these other CLI utilities that we use as part of our development. And so we've listed those explicitly as things that we would like to fund. And so what ends up happening is when you go into StackAid, so you sign in with your GitHub account, you add our app into GitHub. So we're we have the ability to read your private repositories and discover the packages in them. And so I've done that here, and now I'm in my dashboard, and here's the sample project, and it's gone and analyzed the dependencies. And so, here are those dependencies that we saw, and here's solid, and we've discovered its dependencies, and so on. We've discovered the node dependencies. We've discovered the Golang dependencies as well, and so they're all listed here. We have a projected like $15 per month, contribution level, and then you can see what that means for these projects over the course of a year. So the next step would be just to start funding, and it actually takes us through a Stripe checkout process, and then you're basically set. One of the cool things about StackAid and feedback that we got early on is, to give people control, is that we discover these things, and you can select the repositories that are contributing to it. But you have some granularity saying like, oh, I did or did not want my package.json included. This bottom one actually corresponds to the go.mod. A StackAid.json is generated for it, but you can kind of turn these things on and off. And more importantly, and this is kind of based on feedback that we've gotten from the community, is that people want controls to decide where this money is going to actually go, and so we have this process of reallocation. So if an organization like Microsoft, and Microsoft's unlikely to claim the money ever based on what StackAid is doing, but if you really want to make sure that Microsoft never gets any of the the contributions that you're making, then you can basically turn off that organization. So we list the direct dependencies here, and you can see all of the indirect dependency organizations as well, and you can also turn those on and off. By default, things are turned on, but Versal is a well-funded organization, and just circumvent money ever getting allocated to them, and so there are these controls there. So I think that's been super important to people to know where their money is going, and so after the discovery phase, you have this screen to kind of fine tune that.
Yeah, wow. So a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
So based on the samples, I know you can support Go packages. Obviously, you can support package.json files. What's like the scope of languages that you support in terms of like looking at their dependencies and being able to generate this?
Yeah, there's quite a few. We support Python, PHP, Rust, Ruby. We already said Go, JavaScript. I think that's it. Yeah, and then of course, like Deli mentioned, with that producing your own StackAid JSON file, you can literally fund anything that's a repo. It doesn't have to be something that we understand already. Yeah.
Gotcha.
That's awesome. And I had a question about the StackAid.json file. So how do we know how to generate that file? Is there a way to automate that process?
Yeah, yes and no. So we actually use the GitHub dependency graph API, and because it understands a bunch of stuff that we don't necessarily, right? And so it will tell us, oh, this repository has these direct dependencies and these indirect dependencies, and then we take all of that and then we produce a StackAid JSON file for you. We also have a GitHub action that does the same thing, basically, if you wanted to use that. And some organizations don't want to share their code directly with us, and so we have a way to like mirror just things that they do want to share, and then use the GitHub action to produce that file. We're continuing to work on tools like tools that you may use offline, like Dudley said, that you don't declare, like DurianV or Node or something. And we're working on a CLI tool to help you generate a StackAid JSON file for that kind of stuff that you use as well.
Nice.
Yeah. And then, I mean, by the way, the format is super simple. It couldn't be easier to make one yourself. But yeah.
Okay. So then if I'm a person that I want to contribute some stuff, right? I come in, I can paste my JSON file or my dependency file or whatever the case is, right? You show me the breakdown, I hit checkout, and that's it. Like I don't have to sign up. There's no login to StackAid thing. It's just purely, hey, I just want to contribute, and I can just paste and hit checkout, and then that's it.
Not currently. You have to associate. Have to log in with a GitHub account currently.
Okay.
And tell us which repos you want us to look at to discover your dependencies.
Got it.
On the homepage, we just kind of have an example for like, oh, if you have your package JSON file and you want to see like a preview, like, oh, what would the breakdown look like? That's what that tool is for, to just kind of give you a taste. Yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of like just the payment models, do you support one-time payments or are they recurring subscriptions? Like how, or do we have both, right? Like what do we,
Right now, it's a monthly subscription that auto renews every month. And of course, we email you ahead of time to make sure, hey, this thing's going to renew. Check your dependencies, and see like, oh, are you still using this project? Maybe you want to toggle some things, right? But I think we went with that approach first because we believe in sustaining open source for the long term, right? And it's not like you only derive benefit one time. You derive benefit for however long you use these open source dependencies. So that's the model we went with first. People have asked about one-time payments, which I think is definitely something we'll consider doing. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
That's cool. So I have a question. So if I wanted to contribute to StackAid, what does that look like for me as a contributor? Like what does the experience look like for me?
So are you talking about contributing financially to StackAid or in some other
like as an open source contributor to the code?
Oh yeah, so I mean, if you go to our GitHub organization page, we have a number of projects that are currently open source there, and if just feel free to jump in terms of we've had some people file issues, or we also have a discussion section where people have questions about it. So I think those are great ways to get your feet wet. And of course, if people see issues with some of the source or find some bugs, then we'd be more than happy to take a look at pull requests for that.
One of the biggest things that open source developers could do is actually claim their projects. So we've had a number of high-profile open source developers claim their projects on StackAid as being yet another channel that they receive funds through, in addition to GitHub sponsors and Open Collective. So if you are an open source maintainer and this is something that you care about, I think this would be a great thing to do. I think one of the things, we are very much dependent on open source developers evangelizing the channels that they receive money through. And so that's, taking the time to understand how StackAid works and how it potentially could work for them, and then applying it to their projects, I think is probably one of the biggest ways that they can help, help StackAid to be successful. And we've had people go through the process and given us feedback, and so that feedback has been invaluable in terms of us making the core experience significantly better. So if any of this resonates with someone, claiming a project and giving us feedback is probably the number one thing that someone could do.
As you was going through this experience, the one thing I was thinking about in my head was I was imagining like a StackAid VS Code extension where I don't have to tell it where my stuff is. It just knows, right? Okay. It just knows. I mean, obviously there still need to be consent, of course, but like it would just know, right? And it'd be like, oh, okay, you've added another package to your dependency tree or whatever the case is, right? Like, and it, you have your little sidebar and it highlights it for you. And even the same view that you're showing us right now with like the breakdown of the 10 dependencies, like being able to visualize that like inside of your project. I think that would be, for me, I think that would be a really cool thing to like see. Yeah. Be like, oh, look, nice. I just gave this person like $10, right? And then, you keep writing code.
Yeah. Awesome. I think I hadn't considered that, and it just tells you how good of a job I'm doing.
Well, I mean, that's why we have these discussions, right? So we can all like ideate and share ideas together, right?
I love it. I think it's super important to meet people where they are, and I think that's definitely part of it. We've had the pleasure of using the app extensions and things like that GitHub has, and it makes it super simple for people to integrate. We, as Wes mentioned, we're working on CLIs and other tools to meet people in terms of the environments where they're working. But I think being in the editor totally makes sense, and people are spending a bunch of time there, so I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, for sure.
So in addition to the awesome feature that Corey just mentioned, what other features are you, what other features are you working on at StackAid that may be beneficial to open source devs?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of areas that we're working on. I guess I'll highlight 3 of them. One is, continued better support for other platforms. So I think, Wes hit on some of the biggest platforms, but there are a number of other ones that I think are super important. And those communities, while being smaller, are super active. There are companies that depend on them. And I think it's important to put in the effort to be able to engage with those ecosystems. So things like Clojure and Perl and others that are, I wouldn't say neglected, but not necessarily, the number of packages they have are not as large as, say, the JavaScript ecosystem. So we want to make an effort to support them. The second is, we alluded to this, we're working on a CLI tool for funding Brew. So on OS 10, there's the whole Brew ecosystem. Those types of projects that people use via, kind of OS level package managers don't typically get a ton of funding. And so we want to basically take a look at all of the things that you have installed with Brew, discover their dependencies and things like that, generate a StackAid.json, and then you'd be able to find everything that you've installed via Brew. So that's kind of the second avenue in terms of meeting people where they are and funding things that they're using that are not necessarily declared in their kind of open source repositories. And the third thing that we're thinking about deeply at the moment is really about making this visceral. So we can show you your direct and indirect dependencies, which is great. And it gives you one dimension of the extent of how you use open source within your organization. I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of showing you how active those projects are over time, the number of people who are contributing to these projects. So you look at this list and you're like, okay, well, how many people is that, right? What's the aggregate number of issues? Are there more issues, being open than closed? Like, what's the general health of this? And I think the StackAid.dev guys are doing a really good job kind of highlighting that problem on a per repository basis. I think there's room here for us to kind of bring some of that data in and really kind of put the funding lens on top of that. And I think that the point of that is to really, drive home the point about funding, potentially the impact that funding is having on those projects and helping them. But at the very least, like, what is the state of your open source dependencies in aggregate? And, is it trending in the right direction? So those are the 3 areas that, we want to focus on, I guess, for the remainder of the year.
Nice. So you showed us a little bit about like what it looks like for me as a person that wants to contribute. Is there anything special that happens from the perspective of the person that's getting the contribution? Like how does that work? Like, how do you notify them? Do you send them a GitHub issue and be like, hey, we got money for you, come get it? You know what I mean? Like, how does the other side of that pipeline work?
Wes is an expert on this, so you should talk about it.
Well, there's, if you can see in Dolly's screen there's a big claim a project button. So you could hit that for us. And then that will list, that'll take you to a screen where it lists all of the different repositories that you are an administrator of. And in this example, he's just an admin of the sample project. So you toggle on which repositories you want to claim, and then you hit set up new deposit. And that takes you through a Stripe workflow to set up an Express account where you give some banking details and so on so that we can transfer money to you. And then once a month, we run the allocation across all of our subscribers and then pay out the developers who've registered with Stripe automatically. So that's it. They don't have to do anything else, nothing special. Just sign up with Stripe and you get money in your bank account every month. Now, of course, not everyone has heard of StackAid and claimed their repositories, and they may already be on GitHub sponsors or Open Collective or Patreon. I mean, there's a million of these things. And we want to make sure that they get paid too, even if they aren't currently using StackAid. So we identify all of those projects every month, and we go and crawl GitHub and their package.json files to find out how they do accept money. And then we actually go ahead and pay them out manually once a month. And so we have like a few hundred projects actually that we do that for every single month, either through whatever avenue that they use to accept money. And again, there's no contingencies or anything. They do see that the money comes from StackAid, and then of course they can go ahead and sign up if they want to in the future, but there's certainly no obligation currently. Though the one thing that I think is worth pointing out is that every repository, every project that's funded has a public page. And so we're very transparent about all of the money that gets allocated to each project and where it comes from, not just subscribers, but the other dependents, of a particular project and how much money is being shared with them. So, if anybody's interested, they can come and see the entire flow throughout the history of StackAid so far.
So, question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I decided to go on and claim VS Code and say it's my project.
I was going to ask that too.
What happens? I obviously don't own VS Code. I have no rights to it. But I decided
Too late.
to
I've already claimed it.
Was that?
It's too late. I've already claimed it.
Oh, man. I was about to come get it too. Jeez.
Yeah, go ahead. So you have to be an admin. You have to have admin access to the VS Code repo to be able to claim it.
Okay.
And we verify that again through the GitHub app that you install. So you can't just try and claim things arbitrarily. And the thing is, let's say you were an admin and you claimed it. Other people who are admins can also claim it. And what we'll do then is we'll split the money that's attributed or allocated to VS Code equally amongst everybody who's claimed it.
Oh, okay.
For now, that's the model that we think is most fair, because we don't know exactly what the levels of contributions are.
Yeah.
And again, we are transparent about how all of that works. So if people realize like, hey, you should be allocating that money more fairly, the maintainers of VS Code, then that's an issue that community can resolve.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you have a larger project, something like Vue or something on those lines, you can, one person can set an account that, for example, deposits into their Stripe account for their organization. They probably have a formal governance structure and so on, and they can allocate that money as they see fit. So the model that we have can work for a single developer or an organization with any number of people. So we're just concerned with allocating and putting it in a Stripe account, and then we give them lots of options in terms of how they allocate, how they use those funds going forward.
What happens if projects have been going on for a little while, and let's say me and Kadesha are admins in a project, and I decide that I'm done and I'm just gonna chill out, right? And I haven't made any contributions for like 6 months, but I'm just like collecting money, right? Can Kadesha, as the other admin and probably like the sole admin at that point, be like, you need to unclaim Cecil, or I'm just saying, like, if I'm not working, if I'm not active in the project,
Yeah.
and I'm just like
Right.
collecting money, it's not like we're collecting $1 million, but I'm collecting money
Right.
for work that I'm
Yeah.
not actively doing at the moment, right? Is there, like, how do you unclaim a project? Is that a thing that you could do or no?
Yeah, yes, it is. If she removes you as an admin, which would be a prudent decision on her part, then if you no longer have access to that repo or no longer have admin access to the repo, you're no longer going to be able to receive.
Oh, and it just automatically comes off. Okay.
That's right.
So essentially, as long as you have admin access to a repo on GitHub, you can claim a project. So a project can be claimed multiple times on StackAid.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So we've been talking about how you help maintainers earn money. So how does StackAid earn money? Because since a portion of the project is open source, I'm just wondering, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way we do it, typically platforms charge like a base percentage, fee, like, oh, we're going to take 5% of your subscription or something like that, right? The way we do it is slightly differently. So we look at the number of direct dependencies you have. So let's say you have 9 direct dependencies. We are the implicit 10th dependency. So if you are donating $20 a month to your 9 dependencies, you're actually donating $20 a month to 10 dependencies. We're one of those, and so we would get one of those dollars. And we do, however, cap ourselves at I think it's 7.5% currently. So if you only had like one direct dependency, we're not going to take 50% exactly. Right. So we cap ourselves, but we just thought that that's a fair model, that we should just be on equal footing with the other dependencies that you have. Yeah.
Nice.
Well, we wanted to make sure that we're not necessarily better off than the top project on StackAid, right? So we shouldn't necessarily be doing better than React or something on those lines. And so,
right.
If you have a ton of dependencies, then we get less, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So one last
it's so
question.
funny because we agonize over these decisions, like how does the community like react? Are they going to think that's fair? Is it not fair? And then you guys just like, oh, okay. It's like, cool.
I mean, we have to eat, right? We all need to eat, and we all need to live. So there has to be a way to earn money.
Yeah. Again, like I said in the beginning, I think what y'all are doing is hugely commendable for open source sustainability. But I mean, you can't help us if you can't maintain yourselves, right? So
exactly.
I think you gotta take care of yourselves first before you can take care of other people. It's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the pay it forward model that you've implemented in StackAid. That's really unique and really cool.
Thank you.
Cool. So folks, we're almost at the top of the hour. I want to take these last few minutes to kind of just give you all a chance to talk about, hey, if you love StackAid and you've seen what you've seen so far, like, what do you want folks to do? We talked about some contributions to the open source code, but like, what are some other things that you'd love for folks that have just watched this stream to do for you?
Well, Dudley, I do all the work.
You guys are just giving each other
I know we should have a signal or something. I'll at least say I think Dudley made a great point. If you are an open source maintainer, we would love for you to come and claim your projects on StackAid. I think we showed it's a very simple process for you to do that. We also try to blog, not super frequently, but we try to give a lot of technical detail, about challenges that we face and how we overcome them, interesting problems that we're working on and trying to solve, which I think will resonate with a lot of developers, especially how we use certain open source projects and how they benefit us, or how they help us overcome challenges. And then we're on Mastodon and Twitter as well, while that lasts and is useful.
Yeah.
And you can find all of those links on our website on stackaid.us. Yeah.
Got it. So,
Yeah,
so
I think-
Mastodon, GitHub,
We're everywhere.
Twitter.
all the things, right? And folks can
Yeah,
reach out to you.
Yeah, I think, I think an important thing for people to think about, there's funding in open source is a bit of a challenge at the moment, especially given the kind of wide amount of layoffs and how companies are looking at their outlook and stuff like that. And I think this is not probably the most opportune time for companies to have discretionary spending. And that's how a lot of companies look at open source. Unfortunately, it's that it's discretionary, it's optional, we'll wait, we'll wait for it to be a problem down the line. Wes and I are pretty passionate about individuals contributing. And so if you're someone who has the means to fund open source, we would love for someone to do that via StackAid. But honestly, I think just to developers in general, and I think this is our meta point, which is even if StackAid's not the right platform for you to donate to open source, I think it's important to look at GitHub sponsors and Open Collective. I think it is important for people to, think about their relationship with open source and the way that they're going to contribute and things like that, and really be explicit about, funding or not. I think the processes are super simple, and I think it's just, incumbent on people to really think through the type of impact that they want to have. We hope that people conclude that, StackAid is potentially part of that solution, try it out and just see what that experience is like. But I think for us, that's the most important thing, that, like a lot of other things going on in the world, you have to be pretty explicit about what your stance is and what your, where you are. And so I think we're trying to highlight that issue, and we'd love people to just at least take a couple of minutes just to be conscious about the decisions that you're making around this, because I do think they're important and they have repercussions, down the line.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Totally agree. Absolutely.
Well, folks, I think that's the show for today. Thank both of you so much for coming on and talking to us about StackAid. And for folks that are still watching, I'm going to put the link up on the screen again. So it is stackaid.us, not .com. I made a mistake. That's my bad. But make sure you go to stackaid.us. Put in your package JSON, your dependency file, and see what some of the projects that you're dependent on, and try and help support them, because obviously open source sustainability is definitely important for all of us. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. Thank you for coming on. Kadesha, my amazing co-host, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me today. Definitely appreciate you. And thank all of you for watching. So hopefully you'll be back again. We usually here every Wednesday on Stripe Dev Chats. So, if we don't see you next week, we'll be back the weekend after that. So hopefully we'll see you soon. And thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.
See ya.